My name is Emily. I'm 21 years old, studying psychology at Boston University in New York. I'm 5 feet 7 inches and weigh around 130 pounds. David, my stepfather, entered my life when I was 15. He's 6 feet 2 inches with a strong build, weighing around 200 pounds. Our relationship was normal at first, but one evening while watching a movie alone, the boundaries blurred. David looked at me with curiosity and attraction, and after my mom left for a business trip, he touched me, igniting a complex mix of guilt and excitement. We kissed, and that night, we crossed a line that felt both wrong and exhilarating. The days following our first kiss were filled with tension and anticipation. Each moment alone seemed charged with possibility. David would brush past me in the kitchen, his hand lingering just a bit too long on my waist. His compliments turned more personal, more enticing. "You look beautiful today, Emily," he'd say, his eyes holding mine for a moment too long. We didn't immediately act on our desires again, but the promise of more was there, unspoken. One rainy afternoon, with the house to ourselves, David suggested we watch another movie. This time, his hand found mine under the blanket, our fingers intertwining. It was a small step, but it moved us closer to that dangerous dance. We kissed again, more passionately, exploring each other's boundaries, learning what made the other gasp or tremble. I started to crave these moments, the secret meetings where we could be more than just family. We would steal kisses in the hallway, his hands exploring under my shirt, the thrill of being caught adding to the excitement. But we never went further than that, not yet. It was like we were both waiting for the other to make that final jump. As weeks turned into months, our interactions became bolder. David began inviting me into his study under the guise of helping him with work. The door would click shut, and there, in the privacy of his office, we'd lose ourselves to the forbidden. His hands would roam, teaching me about my own body, about the nuances of touch, and how to draw pleasure from it. I felt like I was living a double life, one where I was the diligent student, the good daughter, and another where I was this other Emily, exploring the depths of her own sensuality with David. The secrecy, the taboo, it was all part of the allure. I knew it was wrong, but the pleasure was undeniable, and I found myself wanting more, needing more. One evening, with my mother away again, we didn't stop at just kissing or touching. David led me to his bedroom for the first time. The room smelled of his cologne. Everything about it was him. As clothes came off, fear mixed with excitement. The act itself was a revelation, a moment where I felt both lost and found, the line between right and wrong blurring into nothingness. After that night, everything changed. There was a new, unspoken understanding between us, but with it came guilt, a heavy shadow over our secret. I began to question what we were doing, the implications it had on my family, on my mother. David, too, seemed more conflicted, his smiles less frequent, his touches more hesitant. We continued our clandestine meetings, but something was different. The thrill was still there, but now it was laced with a bitter taste of regret. I started to pull back, spending more time at the library, avoiding being alone with him. David noticed, and one night he confronted me. "Is this what you want, Emily? To stop?" His voice was a mix of pain and challenge. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The pleasure had been intoxicating, but the reality of our actions was setting in. We talked, or rather, I spoke while David listened, about my fears, my confusion. We agreed to take a step back to try and reclaim some semblance of normalcy. The weeks that followed were tense. We avoided each other as much as possible, the house feeling like a minefield of silent accusations and unasked questions. My mother returned, sensing the change in atmosphere but not understanding its depth. One evening, I decided to confront the situation head-on, to talk to my mother. Not about everything, but about the tension, about how I felt David was different when she was away. My mother listened, her face a mask of concern. She spoke with David, and I could only imagine what was said. David moved out shortly after, claiming it was for work, but I knew better. The house felt empty without him, but also lighter, as if a dark cloud had lifted. I continued with my studies, throwing myself into my work, trying to forget the taste of forbidden fruit. But I learned something about myself, about desire and the complexities of human relationships. Years later, I would look back on this time not with regret, but with a sense of understanding about the human psyche, about the thin line between love and desire, and the shadows we all carry within us. After David moved out, life settled into a new rhythm. I focused on my studies, diving into psychology with a newfound intensity, perhaps trying to understand what had happened between us through the lens of my textbooks. My mother was more attentive, sensing my need for emotional support without fully understanding why. I started therapy, not to discuss the specifics of my relationship with David, but to deal with the emotional turmoil it left in its wake. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Helen, who had a way of making you feel safe in your own chaos. She helped me see that what I felt, the attraction, the guilt, was part of a complex human experience, not just a moral failing. Months passed, and I was beginning to heal, to find joy in simple things again. Then, one day at a university event, I saw David. He was there as an invited speaker for a business seminar. The sight of him sent a shock through me. He looked the same but different, more distant perhaps. We made eye contact across the room, and there was a moment where it felt like time stopped. I didn't approach him, but later he found me. Our conversation was awkward, filled with the ghosts of our past. He apologized, not for what happened, but for the pain it caused. He was sincere, and in his eyes, I saw regret. We agreed to leave the past behind, to move on as if we were strangers with a shared secret. Back at home, I decided it was time to tell my mother everything. It was one of the hardest conversations of my life. She listened, her expression cycling through shock, anger, and finally, a deep, wounded sadness. She apologized for not seeing what was happening under her own roof, for not protecting me. We both cried, a catharsis that seemed to cleanse some of the guilt I carried. She told me she would seek her own therapy to understand how she could have missed so much. That night we talked until the early hours, rebuilding our relationship from the ground up. With my mother's support, I decided to take a semester abroad in London. The distance was good for both of us, giving us space to heal separately while still connected. London was a new chapter, a place where I could be just Emily, not the girl with the scandalous past. I made new friends, explored new cultures, and my heart began to mend. I started dating again, cautiously at first, learning to trust and to open up. One guy, Michael, a local artist, seemed to understand the complexities of my past without me having to say much. With him, I felt I could explore love without the shadows of guilt or secrecy. Back in New York for the holidays, I encountered David again, this time at my mother's new apartment during a Christmas party she hosted. He was there with a new partner, someone who seemed to bring light back into his life. Seeing him happy, I felt a strange peace. We exchanged pleasantries, no longer with the weight of our past, but with a mutual respect for the journey we'd both taken since then. I realized that while our past would always be part of who I was, it didn't define me. I had grown, learned, and forgiven, not just David or my mother, but myself. Life was about the choices we make moving forward, not the ones we made in moments of darkness. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey from that first kiss to this moment of reconciliation. I understood that healing wasn't just about closing wounds, but about understanding them, integrating them into the tapestry of our lives. And with that understanding, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next, with a heart full of lessons learned and a soul eager for new adventures. Returning to London after the holiday, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Michael and I grew closer, our relationship deepening into something beautiful and uncomplicated. He was my first love in a landscape free from the shadows of my past. We traveled across Europe, each new city adding layers to our connection, and I found joy in sharing these experiences with someone who cherished me for who I was now, not who I had been. I continued therapy with a local counselor, focusing on self-acceptance and future-oriented growth. The sessions were less about dissecting the past and more about building a future where I could thrive in my own skin without the weight of guilt or secrecy. Upon graduating, I was offered a position at a prestigious psychology clinic in London. My work involved helping others navigate their own complex relationships and personal traumas, and I found a profound sense of purpose in this role. It was as if I was turning my personal journey into a beacon for others, guiding them through their darkness with empathy and understanding. Michael proposed to me under the London Eye, a symbol of both the city and our journey together. Saying yes felt like stepping into a new chapter, where I was not just the survivor of my past, but the architect of my future. Years later, with a stable career and a loving marriage, I decided it was time to reconnect more deeply with my family back in the States. My mother and I had kept in close contact, our relationship having grown strong and resilient. She had moved on, found happiness in her own way, and we decided to spend a summer together in New York. During this time, I met with David again, now a father himself. His child, a little girl with his eyes, brought a new dimension to our interactions. We were no longer just the echoes of our past, but people who had evolved with lives that intersected in a different, healthier way. We shared stories of our lives, laughing about mundane things, healing further with each passing moment. After returning to London, pregnant with my first child, I started writing. My book wasn't about my past with David per se, but about the journey of healing, understanding, and the nuanced dance of human relationships. It was a memoir of sorts, a blend of psychology and personal narrative, aimed at helping others who might feel lost in their own stories. The book became a bestseller, not for scandal, but for its raw honesty and the hope it offered. It opened up conversations about healing from complex family dynamics, about forgiveness, and about moving forward. I dedicated it to my mother, to Michael, and in a way, to David, for all the lessons learned, even if they came from pain. Years later, sitting in our garden in London, with our children playing around us, I felt a profound sense of peace. My life was a tapestry of joys, sorrows, and profound lessons. My mother, now visiting more often, had become the grandmother I always hoped she would be, her laughter mingling with the sounds of children's play. I look back on my journey with David not with regret, but with gratitude for the insights and growth it spurred. Every part of my story, even the most painful, had led me here, to a life of love, understanding, and purpose. As the sun set, casting golden hues over our little world, I realized that every story, no matter how dark, can find its light, its closure, its peace.